We finally have ourselves an HDR monitor for the masses. Today we're looking at the AOC Q27G3XMN, which sports a flat 1440p VA panel with 180Hz refresh rate. It also has a Mini LED structure with full array local dimming and display HDR1000 certification. Now all of this would normally set you back a pretty penny. However, at the time of filming and in the UK, this can be found for just £350, while in the US it can be found for just $280, which is absolutely insane. So in this review you can see if it's actually worth its price tag and to see how it compares with some of its competitors. So jumping straight in, let's talk about its input lag. And here I had it objectively tested at just 0.3 milliseconds. Indeed, it's extremely impressive in this department. Note that this figure was taken at 180Hz with low input lag mode enabled. If you were to go at 60Hz, the option is still available to you, however you will incur a lot more input lag. So just some food for thought if you're going to be connecting this up to a console. Now furthermore, I would like to highlight that the low input lag mode does become grayed out with adaptive sync technologies. In other words, AMD FreeSync or Nvidia G-Sync. And from my own subjective testing, I did notice a little bit of extra input lag. It's not a night and day difference, but will be noticeable for some hardcore competitive gamers. Now aside from all of this, we should talk about its response time. And here there's a few different overdrive modes you can select via the OSD. You've got off, weak, medium and strong. Now via the off mode preset and using the OSRTD tool to give me an objective measurement, you'll be able to see the average initial time at the bottom left hand side of your screen. This translates to the average D2G, which is often referred to by manufacturers. Here it clocked in at 5.98 milliseconds, which is not too shabby. As for the weak mode preset, it goes down to 5.25 milliseconds. Now where things get actually more interesting is in terms of its medium preset, because not only have you got a better average initial time of 4.13 milliseconds, but the percent in window at 180Hz sits at 80%, which is actually pretty good. As for the overall RGB overshoot, it is absolutely minimal. Now I actually preferred using this monitor on its strongest mode preset. Yes, you do incur a little bit of extra inverse ghosting as you'll be able to see via the RGB overshoot table, but the percent in window sits at near 100% with the average initial time dropping down to a stonkingly low 2.37 milliseconds. So yes, indeed, this monitor is extremely responsive. Now to give you a visual indication of the RGB overshoot, you'll be able to see the UFO ghosting test. And yes, indeed, there's minimal inverse ghosting. This is purple trailing, for example, that occurs behind the UFO. However, you will notice a little bit of smearing, and that's pretty much present on most VA panels. Thankfully, on this AOC monitor, specifically towards the higher overdrive modes, which is the ones that I would recommend, so medium or strong, you will find that the smearing effect is minimized. And in my case, while playing a fast-paced FPS shooter, or visually appealing games, or even browsing the web and reading a lot of text, I had no issues whatsoever when it came to the overall legibility and the overall visual experience. What I'm trying to say over here is that while it does have some VA smearing, it is actually kept down to a minimum, and therefore makes this monitor very much usable in many sorts of scenarios. So moving swiftly on, let's talk about adaptive sync technologies. In other words, AMD FreeSync and Nvidia G-Sync. Now given this monitor does not have a native G-Sync module, its VR range sits from 48Hz up to 180Hz. Now in my case, I've got an Nvidia RTX 3080, and when connected over DisplayPort to the monitor, I had no problems running the Nvidia Pendulum demo. I didn't incur any sort of black screen issues or flickering. Furthermore, I was able to run Destiny 2 at 1440p at 180Hz with Nvidia G-Sync enabled and HDR, all of these simultaneously working together to provide a great tear-free gaming experience. Now this does perfectly bring me onto its HDR performance, which I do think is its key selling point, because not only do you have a flat VA panel, but you've also got display HDR1000 certification. In fact, it actually far surpasses the certification with over 1300 nits in terms of peak brightness, which is absolutely insane. Now here you've also got a Mini LED structure with full array local dimming, or more specifically 336 local dimming zones. The combination of all of this means that the overall HDR experience is lifelike, and it can be pretty much unrivaled and unmatched at this price point. In fact, if you do want something similar, you'll have to spend pretty much 2 to 3 times the overall price. Now furthermore, I absolutely love the fact that you have got the ability to enable or disable local dimming via the OSD. I'm not sure why you want to disable it specifically in HDR content, but nonetheless the option is there for you. I would recommend the strong preset in case you get this monitor. Furthermore, it's great to see that you can also enable or disable local dimming in SDR, showing good sort of versatility. As for the overall blooming and haloing effect, it's also kept down to a minimum, which is further impressive, because most monitors with mini LED or full array local dimming often suffer from quite a lot of haloing or blooming, but that's not the case with this monitor. Even in a completely pitch black environment with a mouse cursor going over it and on its strongest mode local dimming zone, it still provides a really good experience, and therefore is not going to throw you off if you're going to be gaming. Now, to round off the gaming section, I would just like to have a quick word for console users. And here the monitor has got two HDMI 2.0 ports, allowing you to run 1440p at 120Hz. You can of course reduce the resolution or indeed the refresh rate, for example at 1080p or 60Hz. Now in terms of the overall response time at 120Hz, here via the OSRTD tool using the medium preset, you can see I had it tested at 3.78 milliseconds, which is very impressive. Even on its strongest mode preset, it drops down all the way down to 2.21 milliseconds. While at 60Hz, on terms of its medium preset, it's 3.7 milliseconds, and on its strongest mode preset, yet again, it's really impressive at 2.09 milliseconds. So yes, indeed, the monitor is very much responsive, be it in terms of PC usage or indeed console usage. But just do bear in mind what I mentioned before in terms of the overall input lag, specifically at 60Hz. So far, the monitor is pretty much faultless. However, things do change when it comes to the overall image quality. First off, you have got a flat VA panel with a matte coating to it, all of which are very much appreciated. However, it's worth noting that due to the panel technology used, it cannot compete with the viewing angles of IPS or OLED technology. With that said, given its form factor of 27-inch, I don't suspect most people will be looking at it from extreme angles, so it should be a non-issue. However, what might cause for a little bit of concern is that this monitor did incur a little bit of brightness fluctuations. They weren't noticeable when I was looking at my desktop or even gaming. However, while using a measurement tool such as the OSRTD tool, I noticed that the brightness was constantly fluctuating. Yes, indeed, it doesn't have any sort of flicker and it's PWM flicker free. However, it might cause a little bit of eye strain for certain people who are very sensitive. It didn't cause any problems to myself, who I would consider myself as pretty sensitive as well, but nonetheless, it's just something I thought I should highlight in this review. Now, what really baffled me, however, is in terms of the overall color accuracy. See here, the monitor via the OSD has got a panel native, sRGB and DCI-P3 modes. Now the latter two do give you full brightness controls, which is very much appreciated, however do not lock the color gamut, which therefore means that it's completely pointless in said modes. Indeed, over here you'll be able to see via my calibrators that in the sRGB mode, that the gamut coverage and the gamut volume were not locked to the sRGB space. In fact, it far surpasses it, and therefore means that the average ΔTE and the maximum ΔTE sit at a strongly high 3.89 and 10.21 respectively, meaning this monitor cannot be used, at least in its current state, for any sort of image editing. Its tested contrast ratio, however, was very impressive at 4,406 to 1, while its measured white point was recorded at 5,535 Kelvin at 100%, which is a little bit off the 6,500 Kelvin target. As for its gamma curve, it does sit pretty close to the 2.2 standard, which is very much appreciated. Now switching over to the DCI-P3 mode via the OSD, yet again it's actually quite laughable. However, you can see here that the gamut coverage and gamut volume sit a little bit closer to the standard, while below you can see how it compares. However, yet again, the average ΔTE and maximum ΔTE are unacceptable at 4.93 and 9.56 respectively. Its tested contrast ratio does not change, however its measured white point does slightly shift at 5,567 Kelvin at 100%. Unfortunately, however, the gamma control are locked and you do not have it sitting at the 2.6 standard, which is required for the DCI-P3 color space. Now indeed those figures are quite odd, so hopefully AOC will look to fix that via future firmware update. If I get any sort of news from the manufacturer, I'll make sure I'll post it down in the description below or indeed in the pinned comments. Now while its color performance is disappointing, the overall brightness is actually really good. First off, with HDR and with local dimming enabled, I recorded up to 1349 nits, so yes, it does get blindingly bright. With local dimming disabled while still remaining in HDR, recorded up to 436 nits, therefore re-emphasizing the point what I made before, that you'll certainly want to have local dimming enabled. Now SDR brightness is still very bright at 544 nits, so therefore it will be very much usable in a bright sunlit room. If you do enable local dimming with SDR, however, it does surprisingly drop the figure to 480 to 500 nits. As for its minimum brightness, it gets all the way down to 67 nits, however with local dimming it goes even further down to 60 nits, therefore making it usable even in a completely pitch black room. Now as for the overall brightness uniformity, which I appreciate is somewhat panel lottery, my tested panel didn't do too badly across the board, although I would have expected a little bit better results. As for the overall backlight bleed, well, it's kept to a minimum, thanks to the fact that it has got a VA panel. Now note, these pictures were taken with the local dimming option disabled, however with it enabled it gets completely pitch black, so much so that my camera really struggled to pick up the image. So with all that out of the way, let's talk about its design. And here it's got a 3-side borderless design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. Although it's worth noting over here that it does have a black and red finish to it, which might not be everyone's cup of tea. As for its stand, it's a little bit elongated for my liking, but does provide a really sturdy feel. Furthermore, it provides you height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments, all of which provides great sort of ergonomics, and is very much appreciated, specifically at this price point. Now, should you want to replace the stand, you can actually do so with a VESA-compatible stand, for example placing it on a multi-monitor setup or a monitor arm. Now, what can't be changed, however, are the OSD buttons. They're a little bit hard to press and a little bit awkward as well. They're found at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. Nonetheless, while accessing the OSD, you'll find a comprehensively laid out menu. It's very easy to understand and provides you all the right options that you'll require, such as, for example, if you want to flick through the different overdrive modes or enable or disable adaptive sync technologies. Now to conclude, I would like to point out that the monitor has not got any built-in speakers. However, you can output audio directly from the monitor via its 3.5mm jack, therefore allowing you to plug in your headphones directly into it. As for connectivity, there are no USB Type-A ports, and there are also no fancy RGB lights, but they don't really bother me in the slightest. But you do have a singular DisplayPort 1.4 input, which will allow you to output 1440p at the maximum refresh rate of 180Hz, and then you've got two HDMI 2.0 ports, which will output 1440p at up to 144Hz. Worth bearing in mind if you're going to be connecting this up to, for example, a laptop. Via my desktop computer, I also noticed that I was able to output 10-bit over DisplayPort, although it's worth mentioning that the monitor is a native 8-bit panel, but then also uses FRC in order to achieve 10-bit. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict, and quite frankly, I absolutely love the AOC Q27G3XMN. Not only because of its fantastic HDR reproduction, but also the fact that it has a mini LED structure with full array local dimming, a very low input lag, a fantastic response time across the board, it operates at 1440p at 180Hz, and has also got adaptive sync technologies. Couple all of this at just £350 in the UK or $280 in the US, and it makes this monitor an absolute no-brainer. As a result, it easily gets my Best Buy awards. Now do consider, however, some of the limitations that I've highlighted throughout this review. For example, the counterintuitive OSD buttons, the fact that it doesn't have those fancy RGB lights or USB ports to play around with, which really don't really bother me in the slightest, but nonetheless worth mentioning, and the fact that you do actually have a little bit of an odd behavior with that color gamut, so therefore you shouldn't use this, at least not at the time of filming, for any sort of image editing work. Nonetheless, hopefully the latter can be fixed via future firmware update, which would make this monitor an even better buy. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of this monitor down in the comment section below, and if you love it as much as I do. Definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification as well if you have enjoyed this independent detailed review. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.